Thank you, Patrick, and it's great to be with you. And I feel like we're moving from the academy into the boxing ring. Because as that great American philosopher poet Mike Tyson once said, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. And I say that as a Northern Irishman who has a twin brother who is on the opposite end of the belief spectrum to my good self. So pugilism is something around the dinner table when our family gets together. On issues of conscience, faith, what does it mean to be human? How do we move forward? But Mike Tyson made that comment when he was asked about Evander Holyfield's plans for him in the boxing ring when they were going to get together to fight. And he said, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. And it feels in the sense that that's the tone of the current debates around religious freedom, that it feels more boxing ring than it does academy. It feels like it's a hot topic. It feels like you could say something wrong that would get you cancelled fairly quickly. And 3 years ago, I think many Christians felt after the last federal election that we'd somehow dodged a bullet when it comes to dealing with the issues around faith and that we would sort them out. Here we are. So we didn't dodge a bullet as much as dodge the boomerang, you know. Hey, it's gone. And then it comes back and hits you on the back of the head. It doesn't feel like in the ensuing 3 years that the temperature has been dialed down on issues. So really what I want to do today, because I'm no great academic, is it's the vibe, Your Honour. I want to give us a bit of a tone for how the debate is being played out in this milieu. Because we can't really hold on for perfect conditions to move forward. We can't really hold on for groups who are historically aligned with us, we would have thought, to cross floors in parliaments, because that's not happening. In fact, it's going the opposite direction. What's going on? And also within faith groups themselves, there are many who wouldn't support certain perspectives that we, in other, particularly in our evangelical perspectives, and also in other conservative faith-based groups outside Christianity, would actively oppose, particularly areas around sexuality and how those matter ethically in alternate ethical communities, such as Christian schools and in church settings. And the language around these debates is no longer considered wrong or silly. I still remember being considered a bit lame when I was outed as being a churchgoer at my government senior high school. But it's more bad and dangerous now and unsafe, some of the things that Christians are purported to believe. And when I wrote Being the Bad Guys, I really had this guy in mind, William Foster from the movie Falling Down, who starts the day being the ostensibly good citizen and ends the day at Venice Beach Pier, standing with a police officer pointing a gun at him like this, and the police officer saying to him, "Come in now, come in. I've got some nice police people here. They want to talk to you. They're really nice people." And there's a discombobulation on William Foster's face as he stands there going, "You mean I'm the bad guy? How did that happen?" And I think many people of faith feel that in the current cultural debates around religious freedom as they pertain to ethical issues around sexuality. How did we get here? How did we get to be the person standing on the Venice Beach Pier saying, how did I get to be the bad guy? And that seems to be a common feature, not just as I think about it in an abstract way, but as a pastor in a church. One of the things that's been interesting is, you know, you give your sermon, you go make a difference, tell everyone about Jesus around the water cooler. Well, that is so 1995, right? Because you just realise there's something about Christianity, even in the workplace, that the people I was ministering to were like, if I say something about that issue, HR might want to talk to me. You go, oh. But you're just telling them about Jesus. Yeah, but you scratch under the surface of that, and there's a whole iceberg under that tip. And in one sense, the person going into a ministry position 30 years ago was considered to be taking the hit for the team going into ministry. Now it feels like the safe job, believe me. In one sense, it's the place that's kind of cloistered, literally, the last bastion. Whereas the people going to the workplace on a Monday to Friday are asking, how do I navigate this space? And it's not just Monday to Friday, it's my work has a say on my social media ideas. or has influence or checks it out? How did it get to be that if I proffer my opinion, it feels like the boxing ring? But it's also about schools, because I'm on the board of a major schools network in Western Australia, and these debates are coming up all the time. What does it mean to be an alternate ethical community in a setting where discrimination, etc., all these perspectives could raise questions about your funding, or if not your funding, your accreditation? Those are the things coming down the line. We kind of need to telescope those issues and say, what is the trajectory that we're on? And I think those are the questions that the average person I speak to, who is a person of faith, is asking. How did it get to be such a hot button topic at the moment when, so even a few years ago, it seemed much easier, because the question that's always asked always comes up, if you say I'm working in churches, and I remember sitting down at a wedding with some extended family members and a young couple who are married and they're gay, and they said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I'm a used car salesman," didn't I? Because I know what the second question's going to be when I say I'm a pastor of a church, because the whole sexuality ethic issue comes to the fore very quickly. And it did, but it ended up being a good conversation. And where Christians are at the moment, and where other people of faith are at the moment, and probably have, I think minority faith groups have felt this for some time, but Christians are starting to feel it more, is that we're kind of playing an away game, not a home game. Do you know the difference between an away game and a home game? I'm an Arsenal supporter. Anyone? Yeah. We suffer for our art, I'll tell you that. But if Manchester United comes down to Arsenal's Emirates Stadium to play, they're playing an away game. So I'm standing there in the pub near Arsenal with my 2 pints. You like that? Excuse me. That's Saturdays. And the Manchester United fans come down and they just mind their P's and Q's, right? Because they know they're playing an away game. It could even be Sheffield United. I know. So, thank you. I hear that, man. But if we go to Manchester, it's an away game. And suddenly I realise I'm not on home turf. And the perceptions about how I should behave in the setting change. We're escorted to the ground. Things are very careful. I don't stand on the table and drink 2 pints and sing songs. I'm careful. People of faith, I think Christianity, particularly in Australia at the moment, is playing an away game. And the discombobulation we have, and sometimes the anger you see, is because we assume we're still playing a home game, and somehow we have a privileged perspective on something that we no longer have a privileged perspective on, that Australia was once a Christian country. So back in the 50s, the Billy Graham Crusades assumed a home game for Australian culture and context. That the main conversation that Billy Graham was saying was, you're Christian, but you're not Christian enough. You've got to be born again, you've got to be saved, or whatever the terms. You should do what you know is right. It was as if there was Australian culture, and then the really good living types of Christians were sort of a subset of that culture. And that the aim of a Billy Graham crusade was to get more people in that big circle to move towards that little circle. It feels now that people of faith are a circle outside the main framework. It's no longer you should do what you know is right and be more Christian than you are, or whatever it is, but somehow you step outside of a secular framework into a Christian side set, I suppose. Because I think being not Christian today is a different way to being not Christian 40 years ago. In general Western cultural settings in Australia, not being Christian 40 years ago, you were not Christian in a very Christian way. And now it feels like these things have come apart, that our vision of what a human being's flourishing looks like, and perhaps even what a human being is supposed to be and do, the telos and goal, has changed. So we're finding this discombobulation, that the frameworks of thinking have changed very rapidly. At the very time that, as Sarah said, we are ahistorical. That people go to university, my daughter goes to Notre Dame in Perth, and she's surprised at the lack of understanding about how we even get to where we are has happened with students of her own age. And it's noted that she's grown up in a household that has valued history a lot. Not just remember when you didn't empty the dishwasher, but real history, what's going on. The frameworks of thinking are very different. So we do live in this away game time. And I'm not sure that we're going to get a home game anytime soon. We have to somehow figure out how to navigate the space playing away game after away game after away game. And that's part of the problem, is that people have felt that heat, that it feels like we're on the ropes a little bit, having had another psychological, sociological punch in the face when it comes to how we go with religious freedom. So really this is about the vibe. This is about how has the tone and feel of our culture shifted in such a way that we feel that it is that away game feeling. And I think the best book I've read on it recently has to be The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Truman. Now Carl Truman says this, and I'll read this and then I'll break it down a little bit. The intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary prioritises victimhood, sees selfhood in psychological terms, regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying, and places a premium on the individual rights to define his or her existence. Now let's break that down. He said the intuitive moral structure. It's in the water. What he's saying is, as Sarah was saying, it's the secular frame, as Charles Taylor says, plays a subtraction story. That secularism is somehow what you've got left over after you clear the detritus of the dogma of religion and things like that from the culture, and you get pure, unadulterated, secular bedrock of society, and that's reality. But as Charles Taylor says, that's a subtraction story. Secularism is a story itself, and it purports to be the whole narrative when really it's just a slice of a narrative itself. It does that. But it's intuitive. It's the air people breathe at the moment. We have to argue a case for religious freedom over and against what purports to be bedrock, when in fact it is already an alternate way of understanding things. The intuitive moral structure. So it is to do with moral frameworks. But social imaginary is the key term that Charles Taylor, in his book A Secular Age, came up with. That you're driving down the freeway and every ad, every pop-up ad on your phone, everything you see creates this social imaginary, this context of what can and cannot be believable and what can and cannot be believable publicly that can be brought into the public square. We inhabit in a social imaginary which is hermetically sealed off from an understanding of transcendence. It's like we live under a dome, like the CBS series, where nothing comes in and nothing goes out. And to argue a case that there's anything transcendent or external is special pleading. And that's a very hard thing to push against. The other thing that Truman speaks about there is victimhood, that selfhood is seen in psychological terms. This is very important. This is the reason why, in many senses, that language is now seen as violence. Because not just violence, and older secular liberalism hasn't quite come to terms with that in its own setting. It's saying we should all have these opportunities to speak freely, but in the light of someone like Herbert Marcuse, we don't tolerate intolerant speech anymore, or some things should not be tolerated. And we're saying, how did we get to that position so quickly? But selfhood is seen in psychological terms. So to speak against someone's selfhood is damage and violence. So you can see how a Christian framework around sexual ethics is no longer just considered wrong, it's considered unsafe. And that raises all sorts of questions about how we do safety. And those are, as you see, things rolled out across our nation. how do we stop unsafe things happening in schools, for example, or in wider cultural contexts? The individual is placed at the centre of the context. It places a premium on the individual rights to define his or her own existence. There's an atomising process going on in this cultural moment as well. And it's born from a philosophical and historical hostility towards mediating institutions. So once, the smallest, I guess the most purest form of a mediating institution transhistorically is the family unit. It buffers the individual from the power structure above of government, the family unit. And you can see that's been played out over the last 50 or 60 years, that philosophically the family unit is no longer seen as a place of safety for individuals, but a place of oppression. What will that mean going forward for religious groups which hold to a certain ethic which the government then considers to be unsafe? What families might need to be, have their families broken up because of their unsafe belief systems? Now, I'm projecting things forward, but there's no handbrake on this issue at the moment, because the individual right to define your own existence is central to this cultural moment and what's going on. So all mediating institutions, all alternate ethical communities, as I would call them, will come under the spotlight in this situation. The great irony to me, of course, is that I think the book could almost be called The Rise and Failure of the Modern Self. My wife is a clinical psychologist. You can say what you like about the sexual revolution, but it's built us a really nice house in Perth down by the river. She's booked out. Booked out. And as she says, there's nothing I haven't seen a man do to a man do to a woman do to a woman, or a woman do to a man. It's a train wreck out there. So at the same time, there's been this narrative of sparkly, bright and shiny. Under the surface, it feels like we can't get that message up. Now, the tsunami wave will arrive at some stage in the next 20 to 30 years, but we have to almost wait that out. Faith-based communities, alternate ethical communities, need to be ready for the human detritus that will wash up from some of the things that are occurring at the moment. It's just the way it is. Let me get to the heart of that individual thinking, and an amazing quote based on Bruce Jenner coming out as Caitlyn Jenner in 2016, and on the front page of Vanity Fair. But in Vice magazine, this statement was made: "The moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, once in every American generation comes a moment that changes the world forever. For millennials, that moment came last night." Now, that might seem trite, that for millennials to compare the celebration of Caitlyn Jenner to the moon landing or the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, let me explain those three episodes. For baby boomers here, I'll speak a bit louder. For baby boomers here, the moon landing, the truth is, if we can go out there and we can explore the outer limits and move out, somehow we will find ourselves in that search out there. And it was a great hope. So that was for the baby boomers. For my ex-gen self, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we wouldn't find ourselves out there, but the walls would fall down. We'd all be, kumbayaing, we are the world, we are the children. 1989, it was a moment of a communal finding. We will find who we truly are across community. Now, the walls have started coming back up again. Hello, Ukraine. And we realise that it's not out there, and it's not across here. And it's completely understandable that the search for authenticity and who we truly are would shrink to who we are internally, because it seems to be the only thing we can now control. Thank you, science. It seems to be that we can loose ourselves from the surly bond of our own physicality and weakness and become who we truly are authentically. And to say otherwise about us is to do violence. These are all issues to do with what it means to be human. And what it means to be human is grounded so much in what we think spiritually, religiously, where humans are headed, how they're headed, and what their goal, their telos is. These are deeply religious questions. And the secular frame is answering them in different ways. I want you to think about how transcendent this issue is. That the same person could be the pinnacle of manhood in 1976, winning the decathlon gold medal, and 40 years later in 2016 be the pinnacle of womanhood, being Woman of the Year. The same person. That's the level of change that we're going through. It's the full bloom of social contract theory, of Rousseau's man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. And for Bruce Jenner, those chains were his manhood and has been able to be released from them. You see the seismic change this is. You see how that to challenge this at any level, and faith-based understandings of the body do that, is not merely to be wrong, but to do violence to someone. To be bad. To be the bad guy, so to speak. And it is the shibboleth issue in the culture. I feel like on the bigger issues of sexual ethics, that if we could just quieten down, this would all probably go away. But somehow it seems to be the hinge moment. And to negate this idea will cast us aside. I think that's the direction it's heading in. And part of that is, and I think Sarah is exactly right where she's saying that students don't know where their framework of human rights comes from, but they'll still build on it anyway as a foundation, with nary a thought as to where it comes from. Mark Sayers, who lives in that most secular of cities, Melbourne. Anyone from Melbourne here? Yeah, they let you out. They let us out from Perth too, just. Mark Sayers' book, Disappearing Church and then Reappearing Church, he's got 2 books. He talks about the secular frame, the post-Christian frame in the West, wants to live the kingdom without the king. And what he's saying is such is that the frameworks of thinking that Christianity has given to the Western world, the world still wants, because it likes them, but it doesn't necessarily want the king that's associated with the kingdom framework. That's, I think, where the students who want human rights come from. We want those things, but can we have them without the king who ushers in that kingdom? And Sayers' book talks about moving from cultural relevance as Christians to what he calls gospel resilience. And I think this is faith-based communities anywhere. The first question is always, how do I fit in and how do I get people interested in us? Because religion's fading away and we'd like to, hello, we're over here, yoo-hoo, cultural relevance. And suddenly they are all coming over the hill and we're going, we're over here, and they're going, yeah, we see you. And you go, well, hang on. We might have to want to change our tactic at that point. And he talks about the need for gospel resilience, that somehow what you believe has to be so embedded in you that it's thick and rich and deep and isn't shaken by these things. And you think about alternate ethical communities such as Christian schools and such as Muslim schools or Jewish schools. Will they be permitted to continue growing themselves as those alternative structures, those mediating institutions that buffer from what government overreach might do? And Sayers says, it comes back to the exclusivity issues again of Christian faith and ethic. And he says, you can sign off on all the major social justice issues of the day, attend any rally you want, But if you're discovered to hold to what he calls the views of exclusivity of Jesus or the exclusivity of the message around sexual ethics that the Bible brings forward, you're beyond the pale. The hiding room is getting smaller. That's what he's saying. You have to be allied in every aspect of where the secular frame is going. It's the kingdom without the king. The great irony, though, is that Christianity has given the tools and frameworks to the culture that are now being used against the Christian framework itself. That's the great irony, I think. It feels like our own tools are being used against us. And C.S. Lewis has the idea of that the post-Christian world is like that street where all the houses have been knocked down and it looks like it's grown up again with just trees, and it looks like a wild area again, except you go there and you find a bit of a window frame and some utensils from a house and some toys, and you realise something's been here before. This isn't vacant land. Something's been built here that we're building upon. So I think, as I say in my book, post-Christian culture has at its disposal the tools, terminologies and categories of the Christian world, but it utilises them in ways that are often hostile to the Christian faith, especially around the ethical matters that we'd hold to. And Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, says that despite our insistence that Christianity is over, the West is firmly tethered to its Christian moorings. And there's truth to that, isn't there? That somehow we want to universalise human rights when really there's no way to universalise them outside of something bigger, something transcendent outside of us. See, the categories remain, but the way these things are filled in and shaped are very different. There's a new way to be a sinner in the Western world at the moment, and there's a new way to be a saint, and there's a new priestcraft who give pronouncements from on high. All these things happen. It's interesting, I've read some things that Ros Ward has been writing, who was one of the architects of the Safe Schools Coalition. And she said these words: "I will never give up fighting for a more free and joyful world." And I went, hey, they're our words. You can't have our words. There's a golden telos to the idea of fighting for a free and joyful world that is distinctly Western, in the sense that it's going in a direction. There's a goal of joy and freedom coming, as every Negro spiritual would have asserted. And now, those words and ideas can be taken by something that has no transcendence or goal or direction and history to it. Now, I actually spoke at a school in Perth to the executive team of the school after the Safe Schools Coalition in Western Australia was asked to come and speak. In the next hour, we're all lining up like planes coming into Heathrow, and they walk in and give their presentation to the executive as to why they should work in their school, and then I'm supposed to come in and explain the Christian ethic around sexuality and how that would work in a school with majority non-Christian students. We met in the corridor on the way out. It was like meeting your old girlfriend in the Isle of Coles, bit awkies, But what struck me was, and this is, I think, crucial to where we can think positively, the previous group, the Safe Schools Coalition, came in and gave their talk, and I just went in and I said, everything you hear about sexuality is this, that sex is a destination. And here's the pastoral implication for your students. Sex is a signpost to a greater destination, a greater intimacy, a greater level of depth of relationship. But if it's your goal, you'll pour everything at it. If it's where you're going to find your true identity and self and where it's going to be your ultimate fulfillment, the culture will throw everything at that. And woe betide anyone who speaks against it. Not because you're speaking against sexuality, but because you're speaking against people's freedom and joy, their ultimate freedom and joy. The ultimate freedom and joy in a Western setting is to find the right romantic relationship, or if you don't wish to find a right romantic relationship, No romantic relationship. But that's the lodestar. That's the place which we move around and determine our understanding. But if Christianity and other faiths are saying there's a transcendent, there's something beyond. We don't live in a domed world. It's not a bubble. So supreme individualism is at the core. And a state that sponsors that and that view of what it means to be human will struggle to have room for alternate ethical communities. Secularism is in fact quite brittle because it doesn't have the confidence to allow pluralism at a true level in the public square in a contested space. It's very, very different. So I think Christian frameworks and religious frameworks are coming adrift that way from a post-Christian framework in Australia. So I usually give the example of Q&A. 25 years ago, if you heard that a Christian was going to get onto Q&A, you'd be going, please, Lord, let them not be crazy, right? Because you would say, what I want is the panellist who's a Christian to sit with other panellists who are not and going, we're all in this together. We all have the same vision of human flourishing, don't we? And you come away sensible. Now, I think maybe that tactic isn't working because I don't think Christian frameworks and religious frameworks in general have the same vision of human flourishing as a secular frame. The point to get onto Q&A might be to highlight difference. Not angry, but angular. Well, that hits different. That seems different to what everyone else thinks. I wonder what if I followed that to its logical conclusion, where it would reach. I think that's a key issue going forward. One of the things, though, too, is the pace of change is what makes us feel like we're just getting a flurry of punches. Ideas that perhaps 15 years ago were a little bit, that'll never happen. Here we are. And the idea that you think's the most shocking isn't. Just go on your phone now and have a look for the latest. Which brings you, I guess, to this issue. Technology has increased the pace of change in areas of thinking around ethics at a rapid rate. Lifestyles that were once the domain of the financial and cultural elite are now democratised through the power of the iPhone. In 2007, if you were told that you can get a device in your hand that can simultaneously give you the worst ideas in the world and make all your kids really depressed, you go, and they want one, you'd probably not want it. But technology has pushed the pace of change to the point that we can't keep up in our heads. See, once ideas that were either crazy or didn't work, they would take a while to filter down through the system. And cultural elites and people with enough money and social capital, even with bad ideas, can survive quite well. Hello, Johnny Depp, Amber Heard. Because they've got enough social capital to stop themselves falling through to the bottom of the pile. But an idea that's formed in Portland can reach your child tomorrow via phone. Can reach 500 school kids in a Christian school who can get up and assent to a doctrine of faith. But the doctrine of faith is there. It's Babylon in your back pocket. We don't have to go to Babylon tomorrow morning for work. It comes with us. It's a huge issue. The influencers of today in all of this thinking are not institutional. They are, I call them iPhonal, because that's where the influence is coming from. You can mainline what I call the secular agenda just like that. That's what's shaping our thinking. That's the social imaginary of the culture we live in. It just is. No wonder we think, how do we move forward in these settings? In her book, Love Thy Body, Nancy Pearcey says, when sex is a religion, then nothing is allowed to stand in its way, especially not Christian morality. It's a very interesting book, Love Thy Body, because she speaks about the fact that we now live in a very dualistic age when it comes to understanding ourselves. There's our psychological part of ourselves, and then there's this skeleton packed in meat, which isn't the real me. And there's been a shift to say that anything I think psychologically is a higher level way of being than who I am enfleshed as a body. And Christianity rejects dualism, rightly so, from back in the day, right? But it's come back. And she's asking the question, how did it get to be that the psychological self you think you are takes precedence over the bodily self that you actually present as? Where did the shift occur? And that is probably where we're at, that I must line myself up with what I think I am, I feel I am, rather than what I am being lined up, taking precedence. And then you can see the issue if you are a psychologist who is a Christian, because already the squeeze is on that you must affirm what someone says about themselves psychologically. I don't know if there's any other health issue where you go to a practitioner and say, this is true of me, affirm that for me. I don't think we do that. But there's this dualistic version of the self in which the psychological component is separated out from the physical component and takes precedence. That's why the conversation is so hot. That's why language itself is actual violence, because it's doing violence to the psychological self. But when she says when sex is a religion, then nothing is allowed to stand in its way, what that really means is that everything must be thrown at it, culturally, legislatively, all those ways, to make that stand up. It must stand up. It must be our social imaginary, and a lot of time and money and effort is made to do it. Here's the little thing though. When you plant a tree that isn't a native somewhere where it shouldn't be planted, you have to have a lot of ropes and pulleys to make it stand up against the wind of reality. That is why we do have psychology practices burgeoning with what's going on culturally at the moment. But I want you to think about the two-level thing that Nancy Pearce is talking about, a bit like two stories to a house. You see, if all you have is the ground floor, a non-transcendent way of looking at the world, transcendence is up, your spiritual view is the second floor of your house, everything else, all the furniture down the bottom, that's all life, that's, sexuality, that's your work, that's your relationships, all that stuff. But up here is your spiritual perspective. Think if you've only got one floor. Everything becomes the most important thing. All the furniture is the same. Now throw the same-sex marriage debate into that. Christians were thinking, upper floor, here's all our spiritual stuff. Sexuality debate, it's ground floor, and people are saying, you are messing with our transcendent stuff. And Christians didn't get that. Coopers probably didn't get that. We thought we could say transcendent issues are up there, everyday life issues are down here, but in a closed system, everything is transcendent. Everything takes on deep significance, so it always feels like a hot button topic, no matter what you're talking about, in a world of psychological selves. Everything is a punch in the mouth all of the time. That's the debate. That's the level. And I'm not saying right or wrong on all of these things, I'm just saying that's what it's like. That's where it is. That's where the media plays it. That's what it's like. Now, 3 years ago, I was speaking to a board of a chaplaincy program that works in government schools, and it was just after the last federal election. And I said, so what now? You dodged a bullet. But what next? Is there a strategy other than throwing a party and going, whoopee? Because it wasn't a bullet, was it? These issues don't go away. And faith-based communities would be remiss for thinking that if we get the right people in the right places in power, those things will change, because we find that across parties, across parties, these issues don't change. That belief systems within the ALP or the LNP or whatever about who we are psychologically and how we shape ourselves are pretty much the same. Our default is the social imaginary that we've been talking about. The question is, have we used our time as smartly as we could have the last 3 years? Now, there's a whole discussion around that, and maybe the next 3 years will show that out. But it's been a boomerang. The issue that we thought we'd dodged 3 years ago, I don't know if we spent as much time getting it right. And I'm on the board of a group of 7 Christian schools, and I feel like we're back where we were 3 years ago. What's going to happen? What will we have to sign off on? What will we refuse to sign off on these matters? That's why conferences such as these are so necessary. They're part of the process of grappling with it, because I think we're at the start of a perhaps 30-year process to figure some of this stuff out. And there are going to be a few rounds to come. Let me bring you back to close to Evander Holyfield. Modelled him on me, clearly. I'm not even bantamweight. It's ridiculous. Tyson said with such bravado, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. Holyfield beat him. And Holyfield did take a punch in the mouth. Several. But here's the thing with plans. He had situational awareness. It meant in the heat of the battle, he could adjust his plans accordingly and shape his way and not feel like he just had to come back swinging with haymakers that would get him landed on the canvas pretty quickly. And Tyson resorted to what? Biting off part of Holyfield's ear. And Holyfield bears the scars to this day. It was a dirty fight. But Holyfield had a plan, and when he got a punch to the face, he was able to step back in his mind and think, how do I map a way forward? I want to encourage us that we will bear some scars with what I think will be an increasingly dirty fight. Don't expect the rules to go, well, this is right, clearly. We must all have religious freedom. Those days are over, baby. You should just let them go. Anyway, I'm not going to go to that song. That's a baby boomer song anyway, isn't it? But we need some long-term strategic thinking. And we can still be standing at the end of 12 rounds. Not because we want to be fighters, but because we've got a telos and a goal, because we have a transcendent understanding of how the world is put together, that we're headed somewhere. And I think in 30 years' time, there's going to be a bit of a body count. And faith-based communities who stay strong will be the place that someone can be washed up, tired out from what's gone on the last 30 years, knock on the door and say, hey, how do you do sexual relations? How do you do forgiveness? How do you do loving people who aren't like you? And if all we've got to say is, just like everybody else, we're no different, they're going to walk away sad. Faith-based communities have got an opportunity, even in the pugilistic contest we're in, to stand firm with a plan and see this thing out, whatever that means for us in the public square. I think that's our hope. Thanks very much.